Chapter 16. Belvane enjoys herself. The entrance of an attendant into his room that morning to bring him his early bran mash had awakened Udo. As soon as she was gone, he jumped up, shook the straw from himself, and said in a very passion of longing, "Bobo, Bilbo, woe, will, woe." He felt it was his last chance. Exhausted by his effort, he fell back on the straw and dropped to sleep again. It was nearly an hour later that he became properly awake. Into his feelings I shall not enter at any length. I leave that to Roger Scurvylegs. Between ourselves, Roger is a bit of a snob. The degradation to a Prince of Araby to be turned into an animal so ludicrous, the delight of a Prince of Araby at regaining his own form, it is this that he chiefly dwells upon. Really, I think you or I would have been equally delighted. I am sure we can guess how Udo felt about it. He strutted about the room. He gazed at himself in every glass. He held out his hand to an imaginary hyacinth with, "Ah, dear princess, and how are we this morning?" Never had he felt so handsome and so sure of himself. It was in the middle of one of his pirouettings that he caught sight of the unfortunate bran mash and uttered the remarkable words which I have already recorded. The actual meeting with Hyacinth was even better than he had expected. Hardly able to believe that it was true, she seized his hands impulsively and cried, "Oh, Prince Udo! Oh, my dear, I am so glad!" Udo twirled his moustache and felt a very gay dog indeed. At breakfast, where Udo did himself extremely well, they discussed plans. The first thing was to summon the Countess into their presence. An attendant was sent to fetch her. "If you would like me to conduct the interview," said Udo, "I've no doubt that—"
"I think I shall be all right now that you are with me. I shan't feel so afraid of her now."
The attendant came in again.
"Her ladyship is not yet down, your royal highness."
"Tell her that I wish to see her directly she is down," said the princess. The attendant withdrew. "You were telling me about this army of hers," said Udo. "One of my ideas, I had a good many while I was, in retirement, was that she could establish the army properly at her own expense, and that she herself should be perpetual orderly sergeant."
"Isn't that a nice thing to be?"
asked Hyacinth innocently. "It's a horrible thing to be. Another of my ideas was that—" The attendant came in again.
"Her ladyship is a little indisposed and is staying in bed for the present."
"Oh, did her ladyship say when she thought of getting up?"
"Her ladyship didn't seem to think of getting up at all today. Her ladyship told me to say that she didn't seem to know when she'd get up again."
The attendant withdrew, and Hyacinth and Udo, standing together in a corner, discussed the matter anxiously.
"I don't quite see what we can do," said Hyacinth. "We can't pull her out of bed. Besides, she may really be ill. Supposing she stays there forever."
"Of course," said Udo, "it would be rather—
You see, if we
might possibly— Good morning, all," said Belvane, sweeping into the room. She dropped a profound curtsy to the princess. "Your Royal Highness," and Prince Udo, looking his own charming self again. She had made a superb toilette. In her flowing gold brocade, cut square in front to reveal the whitest of necks, with her black hair falling in 2 braids to her knees and twined with pearls which were caught up in loops at her waist, she looked indeed a queen, while Hyacinth and Udo, taken utterly by surprise, seemed to be 2 conspirators whom she had caught in the act of plotting against her.
I thought you weren't well, Countess,"
said Hyacinth, trying to recover herself. "I not well?" cried Belvane, clasping her hands to her breast. "I thought it was his Royal Highness who— but he's looking a true prince now." She turned her eyes upon him, and there was in that look so much of admiration, humor, appeal, impudence, I don't know what, and Roger cannot tell us either, that Udo forgot entirely what he was going to say, and could only gaze at her in wonder. Her mere entry dazzled him. There is no knowing with a woman like Belvane, and I believe she had purposefully kept herself plain during these last few days so that she might have the weapon of her beauty to fall back upon in case anything went wrong. Things had indeed gone wrong. Udo had become a man again, and it was against the man that this last weapon was directed. Udo himself was only too ready. The fact that he was once more attractive to women meant as much as anything to him. To have been attractive to Hyacinth would have contented most of us, but Udo felt a little uncomfortable with her. He could not forget the last few days, nor the fact that he had once been an object of pity to her. Now Belvane had not pitied him. Hyacinth had got control of herself by this time.
"Enough of this, Countess," she said with dignity. "We have not forgotten the treason which you were plotting against the state. We have not forgotten your base attack upon our guest, Prince Udo. I order you now to remain within the confines of the palace until we shall have decided what to do with you. You may leave us."
Belvane dropped her eyes meekly. "I am at your Royal Highness's commands. I shall be in my garden when your Royal Highness wants me." She raised her eyes, gave one fleeting glance to Prince Udo, and withdrew.
"A hateful woman," said Hyacinth. "What shall we do with her?"
"I think," said Udo, "that I had better speak to her seriously first. I have no doubt that I can drag from her the truth of her conspiracy against you. There may be others in it, in which case we shall have to proceed with caution. On the other hand, it may be just misplaced zeal on her part, in which case—
"Was it misplaced zeal which made her turn you into a—"
Udo held up his hand hastily. "I have not forgotten that," he said. "Be sure that I shall exact full reparation. Let me see. Which is the way to her garden?" Hyacinth did not know quite what to make of her guest. At the moment when she first saw him in his proper form, the improvement on his late appearance had been so marked that he had seemed almost the handsome young prince of her dreams. Every minute after that had detracted from him. His face was too heavy, his manner was too pompous. One of these days he would be too fat. Moreover, he was just a little too sure of his position in her house. She had wanted his help, but she did not want so much of it as she seemed to be likely to get. Udo, feeling that it was going to be a rather nice day, went into Belvane's garden. He had been there once before. It seemed to him a very much prettier garden this morning, and the woman who was again awaiting him much more desirable. Belvane made room for him on the seat next to her. "This is where I sit when I write my poetry," she said. "I don't know if your Royal Highness is fond of poetry." "Extremely," said Udo. "I have never actually written any, or indeed read much, but I have a great admiration for those who, admire it. But it was not to talk about poetry that I came out here, Countess." "No?" said Belvane. "But your Royal Highness must have read the works of Sasharino, the famous bard of Araby." "Sasharino, of course. Blood for something. He who something. I mean, it's a delightful little thing. Everybody knows it. But it was to talk about something very different that I— Blood for blood, and shoon for shoon. He who runs may read my rune," quoted Belvane softly. "It is perhaps Sasharino's most perfect gem." "That's it!" cried Udo excitedly. I knew it! If only I could— He broke off suddenly, remembering the circumstances in which he had wanted it. He coughed importantly and explained for the third time that he had not come to talk to her about poetry. "But of course, I think his most noble poem of all," went on Belvane, apparently misunderstanding him,
is the ode to your Royal Highness upon your coming of age. Let me see, how does it begin? Prince Udo, so dashing and bold, is apparently 18 years old. It is 18 years since this wonderful prince was born in the palace, I'm told.
These court poets, said Udo with an air of unconcern. Flatter one, of course. If he expected a compliment, he was disappointed.
There, I cannot judge, said Belvane, until I know your Royal Highness better.
She looked at him out of the corner of her eyes.
Is your Royal Highness very dashing?
One, that is to say. He waded on uncomfortably, feeling less dashing every moment. He should have realized at once that it was an impossible question to answer.
Your Royal Highness, said Belvane modestly, must not be too dashing with us poor Euralians.
For the 4th time, Udo explained that he had come there to speak to her severely, and that Belvane seemed to have mistaken his purpose.
Oh, forgive me, Prince Udo, she begged. I quite thought that you had come out to commune soul to soul with a fellow lover of the beautiful.
No, said Udo. Not exactly.
Then what is it? She cried, clasping her hands eagerly together. I know it will be something exciting.
Udo stood up. He felt that he could be more severe a little farther off. He moved a few yards away and then turned round towards her, resting his elbow on the sundial. Countess, he began sternly, 10 days ago, as I was starting on my journey hither, I was suddenly—
Just a moment,
said Belvane, whispering eagerly to herself rather than to him, and she jumped up with a cushion from the seat where she was sitting and ran across and arranged it under his elbow.
He would have been so uncomfortable,
she murmured, and she hurried back to her seat again and sat down and gazed at him with her elbows on her knees and her chin resting on her hands.
Now, go on telling me,
she said breathlessly. Udo opened his mouth with the obvious intention of obeying her, but no words came. He seemed to have lost the thread of his argument. He felt a perfect fool, stuck up there with his elbow on a cushion, just as if he were addressing a public meeting. He looked at his elbow as if he expected to find a glass of water there ready, and Belvane divined his look and made a movement as if she were about to get it for him. It would be just like her. He flung the cushion from him.
Oh, mind the roses, cried Belvane,
and came down angrily to her. Belvane looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. You! Oh, don't look like that!
Like that?
Said Belvane, looking like it again. Don't do it! Shouted Udo, and he turned and kicked the cushion down the flagged path. Stop it! Belvane stopped it.
Do you know, she said, I'm rather frightened of you when you're angry with me.
I am angry. Very, very angry. Excessively annoyed.
I thought you were,
she sighed. And you know very well why. She nodded her head at him.
It's my dreadful temper, she said. I do such thoughtless things when I lose my temper.
She sighed again and looked meekly at the ground. Well, you shouldn't, said Udo weakly.
It was the slight to my sex that made me so angry. I couldn't bear to think that we women couldn't rule ourselves for such a short time, and that a man had to be called in to help us.
She looked up at him shyly.
Of course, I didn't know then what the man was going to be like, but now that I know—
Suddenly she held her arms out to him beseechingly.
Stay with us, Prince Udo, and help us. Men are so wise, so brave, so generous. They know nothing of the little petty feelings of revenge that women indulge.
Really, Countess, we Of course there is a good deal in what you say, and
Won't you sit down again, Prince Udo? Udo sat down next to her. And now, said Belvane, let's talk it over comfortably, as friends should.
Of course, began Udo. I quite see your point. You hadn't seen me. You didn't know anything about me. To you, I might have been just any man.
I knew a little about you when you came here. Beneath the, outward mask, I saw how brave and dignified you were. And even if I could have got you back into your proper form again, I think I should have been afraid to, because I didn't know then how generous, how forgiving you were.
It seemed to be quite decided that Udo was forgiving her. When a very beautiful woman thanks you humbly for something you have not yet given her, there is only one thing for a gentleman to do. Udo patted her hand reassuringly.
Oh, thank you, your Royal Highness. She gave herself a little shake and jumped up. And now, shall I show you my beautiful garden?
A garden with you in it, dear Countess, is always beautiful, he said gallantly. And it was not bad, I think, for a man who had been living on watercress and bran mash only the day before. They wandered round the garden together. Udo was now quite certain it was going to be a nice day. It was an hour later when he came into the library. Hyacinth greeted him eagerly.
Well?
She said. Udo nodded his head wisely. I have spoken to her about her conduct to me, he said. There will be no more trouble in that direction, I fancy. She explained her conduct to me very fully, and I have decided to overlook it this time.
But her robberies, her plots, her conspiracy against me!
Udo looked blankly at her for a moment and then pulled himself together. I am speaking to her about that this afternoon, he said. Chapter 17. The King of Barodia drops the whisker habit. King Merriwig sat in his tent, his head held well back, his eyes gazing upwards. His rubicund cheeks were for the moment a snowy white. A hind of the name of Carlo had him firmly by the nose. Yet King Merriwig neither struggled nor protested. He was, in fact, being shaved. The court barber was in his usual conversational mood. He released His Majesty's nose for a moment, and as he turned to sharpen his razor, remarked,
Terrible war, this. Terrible,
agreed the king.
Don't seem no end to it, like. Well, said Merriwig, we shall see.
The barber got to work again.
Do you know what I should do to the King of Barodia if I had him here?
Merriwig did not dare to speak, but he indicated with his right eye that he was interested in the conversation.
I'd shave his whiskers off,
said Carlo firmly. The king gave a sudden jerk, and for the moment there were signs of a battle upon the snow. Then the king leant back again, and in another minute or so the operation was over.
It will soon be all right,
said Carlo, mopping at His Majesty's chin.
Your Majesty shouldn't have moved. It was my own fault, Carlo. You gave me a sudden idea, that's all. You're welcome, Your Majesty.
As soon as he was alone, the king took out his tablets. On these he was accustomed to record any great thoughts which occurred to him during the day. He now wrote in them these noble words.
Jewels of wisdom may fall from the meanest of hinds.
He struck a gong to summon the Chancellor into his presence.
I have an idea,
he told the Chancellor. The Chancellor hid his surprise and expressed his pleasure.
Tonight, I propose to pay a secret visit to His Majesty, the King of Barodia. Which of the many tents yonder have my spies located as the royal one?
The big one in the center,
above which the royal arms fly." "I thought as much. Indeed, I have often seen His Majesty entering it, but one prefers to do these things according to custom. Acting on the information given me by my trusty spies, I propose to enter the King of Barodia's tent at the dead of night, and—"
The Chancellor shuddered in anticipation.
"and shave his whiskers off."
The Chancellor trembled with delight.
"Your Majesty," he said in a quavering voice, 40 years, man and boy, have I served your Majesty, and your Majesty's late lamented father, and never have I heard such a beautiful plan."
Merriwig struggled with himself for a moment, but his natural honesty was too much for him.
"It was put into my head by a remark of my court barber's," he said casually. "But of course the actual working out of it has been mine."
"Jewels of wisdom," said the Chancellor sententiously, "may fall from the meanest of hinds."
"I suppose,"
said Merriwig, taking up his tablets and absently scratching out the words written thereon,
"there is nothing in the rules against it."
"By no means, your Majesty. In the Annuals of Euralia there are many instances of humour similar to that which your Majesty suggests. Humour, if I may say so, which, while evidencing to the ignorant only the lighter side of war, has its roots in the most fundamental strategical considerations."
Merriwig regarded him with admiration. This was indeed a Chancellor.
"The very words," he said, "which I said to myself when the idea came to me. The fact, I said, that this will help us to win the war must not disguise from us the fact that the King of Barodia will look extremely funny without his whiskers. Tonight I shall sally forth and put my plan into practice."
At midnight, then, he started out. The Chancellor awaited his return with some anxiety. This might well turn out to be the decisive stroke, or strokes, of the war. For centuries past, the ruling monarchs of Barodia had been famous for their ginger whiskers. As lost as the King of Barodia without his whiskers was indeed a proverb of those times. A king without a pair, and at such a crisis in his country's fortunes? It was inconceivable. At the least, he would have to live in retirement until they grew again, and without the leadership of their king, the Barodian army would become a rabble. The Chancellor was not distressed at the thought. He was looking forward to his return to Euralia, where he kept a comfortable house. It was not that his life in the field was uninteresting. He had as much work to do as any man. It was part of his business, for instance, to test the pretensions of any new wizard or spellmonger who was brought into the camp. Such and such a quack would seek an interview on the pretext that for 500 crowns he would turn the King of Barodia into a small black pig. He would be brought before the Chancellor.
"You say that you can turn a man into a small black pig?" the Chancellor would ask.
"Yes, your lordship. It came to me from my grandmother."
"Then turn me,"
the Chancellor would say simply. The so-called wizard would try. As soon as the incantation was over, the Chancellor surveyed himself in the mirror. Then he nodded to a couple of soldiers, and the impostor was tied backwards onto a mule and driven with jeers out of the camp. There were many such impostors, who at least made a mule out of it, and the Chancellor's life did not lack excitement. But he yearned now for the simple comforts of his home. He liked pottering about his garden when his work at the palace was finished. He liked, over the last meal of the day, to tell his wife all the important things he had been doing since he had seen her, and to impress her with the fact that he was the holder of many state secrets which she must not attempt to drag from him. A woman of less tact would have considered the subject closed at this point, but she knew that he was only longing to be persuaded. However, as she always found the secrets too dull to tell anyone else, no great harm was done.
"Just help me off with this cloak," said a voice in front of him. The Chancellor felt about until his hands encountered a solid body.
He undid the cloak, and the king stood revealed before him.
Thanks. Well, I've done it. It went to my heart to do it at the last moment. So beautiful they were. But I nerved myself to it. Poor soul, he slept like a lamb through it all. I wonder what he'll say when he wakes up. Did you bring them back with you? Asked the Chancellor excitedly. My dear Chancellor, what a question!
He produced them from his pocket.
In the morning, we'll run them up on the flagstaff for all Barodia to see.
He won't like that, said the Chancellor, chuckling.
I don't see what he can do about it,
said Merriwig. The King of Barodia didn't quite see either. A fit of sneezing woke him up that morning, and at the same moment he felt a curious draft about his cheeks. He put his hand up, and immediately knew the worst.
"Hello there!"
he bellowed to the sentry outside the door. "Your Majesty," said the sentry, coming in with alacrity. The king bobbed down again at once.
"Send the Chancellor to me,"
said an angry voice from under the bedclothes. When the Chancellor came in, it was to see the back only of his august monarch.
"Chancellor,"
said the king,
"prepare yourself for a shock."
"Yes, sir," said the Chancellor, trembling exceedingly.
"You are about to see something which no man in the history of Barodia has ever seen before."
The Chancellor, not having the least idea what to expect, waited nervously. The next moment, the tent seemed to swim before his eyes, and he knew no more. When he came to, the king was pouring a jug of water down his neck and murmuring rough words of comfort in his ear.
"Oh, your Majesty,"
said the poor Chancellor.
"Your Majesty! I don't know what to say! Your Majesty!"
He mopped at himself as he spoke, and the water trickled from him onto the floor.
"Pull yourself together,"
said the king sternly.
"We shall want all your wisdom, which is notoriously not much, to help us in this crisis."
"Your Majesty, who has dared to do this grievous thing?"
"You fool! How should I know? Do you think they did it while I was awake?"
The Chancellor stiffened a little. He was accustomed to being called a fool, but that was by a man with a terrifying pair of ginger whiskers. From the rather fat and uninspiring face in front of him, he was inclined to resent it.
"What does your Majesty propose to do?"
he asked shortly.
"I propose to do the following. Upon you rests the chief burden."
The Chancellor did not look surprised.
"It will be your part to break the news as gently as possible to my people. You will begin by saying that I am busy with a great enchanter who has called to see me, and that therefore I am unable to show myself to my people this morning. Later on in the day, you will announce that the enchanter has shown me how to defeat the wicked Euralians. You will dwell upon the fact that this victory, as assured by him, involves an overwhelming sacrifice on my part, and that for the good of my people, I am willing to endure it. Then you will solemnly announce that the sacrifice I am making, have indeed already made, is nothing less than— What are all those fools cheering for out there?"
A mighty roar of laughter rose to the sky.
"Here, what's it all about? Just go and look."
The Chancellor went to the door of the tent and saw. He came back to the king, striving to speak casually.
"Just a humorous emblem that the Euralians have raised over their camp," he said. "It wouldn't amuse your Majesty."
"I am hardly in a mood for joking," said the king. "Let us return to business. As I was saying, you will announce to the people that the enormous sacrifice which their king is prepared to make for them consists of— There they go again! I must really see what it is. Just pull the door back so that I may see without being seen."
It really wouldn't amuse your Majesty."
"Are you implying that I have no sense of humor?" said the king sternly.
"Oh, no, sire, but there are certain jokes in the poorest of taste, that would naturally not appeal to so delicate a palate as your majesty's. This, strikes me as one of them.
Of that I am the best judge, said the king coldly. Open the door at once.
The chancellor opened the door, and there before the king's eyes, flaunting themselves in the breeze beneath the royal standard of Euralia, waved his own beloved whiskers. The king of Barodia was not a lovable man, and his daughters were decidedly plain. But there are moments when one cannot help admiring him. This was one of them.
You may shut the door, he said to the chancellor. The instructions which I gave to you just now, he went on in the same cold voice, are cancelled. Let me think for a moment.
He began to walk up and down his apartment.
You may think too, he added kindly. If you have anything not entirely senseless to suggest, you may suggest it.
He continued his pacings. Suddenly, he came to a dead stop. He was standing in front of a large mirror. For the first time since he was 17, he had seen his face without whiskers. His eyes still fixed on his reflection, he beckoned the chancellor to approach.
Come here,
he said, clutching him by the arm.
You see that?
He pointed to the reflection.
That is what I look like. The mirror hasn't made a mistake of any kind. This is really and truly what I look like?
Yes, sire. For a little while the king continued to gaze fascinated at his reflection, and then he turned on the chancellor.
You coward, he said. You weak-kneed, jelly-souled, paper-livered imitation of a man! You cringe to a king who looks like that? Why, you ought to kick me!
The chancellor remembered that he had one kick owing to him. He drew back his foot, and then a thought occurred to him. You might kick me back, he pointed out.
I certainly should,
said the king. The chancellor hesitated a moment.
I think, he said, that these private quarrels in the face of the common enemy are to be deplored.
The king looked at him, gave a short laugh, and went on walking up and down.
That face again,
he sighed as he came opposite the mirror.
No, it's no good. I can never be king like this. I shall abdicate.
But, your majesty, this is a very terrible decision. Could not your majesty live in retirement until your majesty had grown your majesty's whiskers again? Surely this is—
The king came to a stand opposite him and looked down on him gravely.
Chancellor, he said, those whiskers which you have just seen fluttering in the breeze have been for more than 40 years my curse. For more than 40 years, I have had to live up to those whiskers, behaving not as my temperament, which is a kindly, indeed a genial one, bade me to behave, but as those whiskers insisted I should behave. Arrogant, hasty-tempered, overbearing. These are the qualities which have been demanded of the owner of those whiskers. I played a part which was difficult at first. Of late, it has, alas, been more easy. Yet it has never been my true nature that you have seen.
He paused and looked silently at himself in the glass.
But, your majesty, said the chancellor eagerly, why choose this moment to abdicate? Think how your country will welcome this new king whom you have just revealed to me. And yet, he added regretfully, it would not be quite the same.
The king turned round to him.
There spoke a true Barodian, he said. It would not be the same. Barodians have come to expect certain qualities from their rulers, and they would be lost without them. A new king might accustom them to other ways, but they are used to me, and they would not like me different. No, Chancellor, I shall abdicate. Do not wear so sad a face for me. I am looking forward to my new life with the greatest of joy.
The Chancellor was not looking sad for him. He was looking sad for himself, thinking that perhaps a new king might like changes in chancellors equally with changes in manners or whiskers.
But what will you do?
He asked.
I shall be a simple subject of the new king, earning my living by my own toil.
The Chancellor raised his eyebrows at this.
I suppose you think, said the king haughtily, that I have not the intelligence to earn my own living.
The Chancellor with a cough remarked that the very distinguished qualities which made an excellent king did not always imply the corresponding, and so on.
That shows how little you know about it. Just to give one example, I happen to know that I have in me the makings of an excellent swineherd.
A swineherd?
The man who, herds the swine. It may surprise you to hear that, posing as a swineherd, I have conversed with another of the profession upon his own subject without his suspecting the truth. It is just such a busy outdoor life as I should enjoy. One herds, and one milks, and one milks, and herds, and so it goes on day after day.
A happy smile, the first the Chancellor had ever seen there, spread itself over his features. He clapped the Chancellor playfully on the back and added,
I shall simply love it.
The Chancellor was amazed. What a story for his dinner parties when the war was over.
How will you announce it?
He asked, and his tone struck a happy mean between the tones in which you address a monarch and a pig-minder, respectively.
That will be your duty. Now that I have shaken off the curse of those whiskers, I am no longer a proud man, but even a swineherd would not care for it to get about that he had been forcibly shaved while sleeping. That this should be the last incident recorded of me in Barodian history is unbearable. You will announce, therefore, that I have been slain in fair combat, though at the dead of night, by the king of Euralia, and that my whiskers fly over his royal tent as a symbol of his victory.
He winked at the Chancellor and added,
It might as well get about that someone had stolen my magic sword that evening.
The Chancellor was speechless with admiration and approval of the plan. Like his brother of Euralia, he too was longing to get home again. The war had arisen over a personal insult to the king. If the king was no longer king, why should the war go on?
I think, said the future swineherd, that I shall send a note over to the king of Euralia, telling him my decision. Tonight, when it is dark, I shall steal away and begin my new life. There seems to be no reason why the people should not go back to their homes tomorrow. By the way, that guard outside there knows that I wasn't killed last night. That's rather awkward.
I think, said the Chancellor, who was already picturing his return home and was not going to be done out of it by a common sentry.
I think I could persuade him that you were killed last night.
Oh, well then, that's all right.
He drew a ring from his finger.
Perhaps this will help him to be persuaded. Now leave me while I write to the king of Euralia.
It was a letter which Merriwig was decidedly glad to get. It announced bluntly that the war was over, and added that the king of Barodia proposed to abdicate. His son would rule in his stead, but he was a harmless fool and the king of Euralia need not bother about him. The king would be much obliged if he would let it get about that the whiskers had been won in a fair fight. This would really be more to the credit of both of them. Personally, he was glad to be rid of the things, but one has one's dignity. He was now retiring into private life, and if it were rumored abroad that he had been killed by the king of Euralia, matters would be much more easy to arrange. Merriwig slept late after his long night abroad, and he found this note waiting for him when he awoke. He summoned the Chancellor at once.
What have you done about those, trophies?
He asked.
They are fluttering from your flagstaff, sire, at this moment. Ah, and what do my people say? They are roaring with laughter, sire, at the whimsical nature of the jest. Yes, but what do they say? Some say that your majesty, with great cunning, ventured privily in the night and cut them off while he slept. Others, that with great bravery you defeated him in mortal combat and carried them away as the spoils of the victor. Oh, and what did you say?
The Chancellor looked reproachful.
Naturally, your majesty, I have not spoken with them. Ah, well, I have been thinking it over in the night, and I remember now that I did kill him. You understand? Your majesty's skill in swordplay will be much appreciated by the people. Quite so, said the king hastily. Well, that's all. I'm getting up now, and we're all going home tomorrow.
The Chancellor went out, rubbing his hands with delight. Chapter 18. The Veteran of the Forest entertains two very young people. Do you remember the day when the Princess Hyacinth and Wiggs sat upon the castle walls and talked of Udo's coming? The princess thought he would be dark, and Wiggs thought he would be fair, and he was to have the purple room, or was it the blue? And anyhow, he was to put the Countess in her place and bring happiness to Euralia. That seemed a long time ago to Hyacinth now, as once more she sat on the castle walls with Wiggs. She was very lovely. She longed to get rid of that outside help in our affairs, which she had summoned so recklessly. They were 2 against 1 now. Belvane actively against her was bad enough, but Belvane in the background with Udo as her mouthpiece. Udo specially asked in to give the benefit of his counsel. This was 10 times worse.
"What do you do, Wiggs?" she asked, "when you are very lonely and nobody loves you?"
Dance,
said Wiggs promptly.
"But if you don't want to dance?"
Wiggs tried to remember those dark ages, about a week ago, when she couldn't dance.
"I used to go into the forest," she said, "and sit under my own tree. And by, everybody loved you."
"I wonder if they'd love me."
"Of course they would. Shall I show you my special tree?"
"Yes, but don't come with me. Tell me where it is. I want to be unhappy alone."
So Wiggs told her how you followed her special path, which went in at the corner of the forest, until by and by the trees thinned on either side, and it widened into a glade, and you went downhill and crossed the brook at the bottom, and went up the other side until it was all trees again, and the first and the biggest and the oldest and the loveliest was hers. And you turned round and sat with your back against it, and looked across to where you'd come from, and then you knew that everything was all right.
"I shall find it,"
said Hyacinth, as she got up.
"Thank you, dear."
She found it. She sat there, and her heart was very bitter at first against Udo and against Belvane, and even against her father for going away and leaving her. But by and by the peace of the place wrapped itself around her, and she felt that she could find a way out of her difficulties somehow. Only she wished that her father would come back, because he loved her, and she felt that it would be nice to be loved again. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice from behind her. She turned suddenly as a tall young man stepped out from among the trees.
"Oh, who are you, please?"
she asked, amazed at his sudden appearance. His dress told her nothing, but his face told her things which she was glad to know. "My name," he said, "is Cornell."
"It is a pretty name."
"Yes, but don't be led away by it. It belongs to nobody very particular. Do you mind if I sit down? I generally sit down here about this time."
"Oh, do you live in the forest?"
"I have lived here for the last week." He gave her a friendly smile and added, "You're late, aren't you?"
"Late?"
"Yes. I've been expecting you for the last 7 days."
"How did you know there was any me at all?"
smiled Hyacinth.
With a movement of his hand, Coronel indicated the scene in front of him.
There had to be somebody for whom all this was made. It wanted somebody to say thank you to it now and then.
Haven't you been doing that all this week?
Me? I wouldn't presume. No, it's your glade, and you've neglected it shamefully.
There's a little girl who comes here, said Hyacinth. I wonder if you have seen her? Coronel turned away. There were secret places in his heart into which Hyacinth could not come. Yet.
She danced, he said shortly.
There was silence between them for a little, but a comfortable silence, as if they were already old friends. You know, said Hyacinth, looking down at him as he lay at her feet, you ought not to be here at all, really.
I wish I could think that, said Coronel. I had a horrible feeling that duty called me here. I love those places where one really oughtn't to be at all, don't you?
I love being here, sighed Hyacinth. Wiggs was quite right. Seeing him look up at her, she added, Wiggs is the little girl who dances, you know.
She would be right, said Coronel, looking away from her.
Hyacinth felt strangely rested. It seemed that never again would anything trouble her. Never again would she have only her own strength to depend upon. Who was he? But it did not matter. He might go away and she might never see him again, but she was no longer afraid of the world. I thought, she said, that all the men of Euralia were away fighting.
So did I, said Coronel.
What are you then? A prince from a distant country? An enchanter? A spy sent from Barodia? A traveling musician? You see, I give you much to choose from.
You leave me nothing to be but what I am. Coronel.
And I am Hyacinth.
He knew, of course, but he made no sign. Hyacinth, he said, and he held out his hand.
Coronel,
she answered as she took it. The brook chuckled to itself as it hurried past below them.
Hyacinth got up with a little sigh of contentment. Well, I must be going, she said.
Must you really be going? Asked Coronel. I wasn't saying goodbye, you know.
I really must.
It's a surprising thing about the view from here, said Coronel, that it looks just as nice tomorrow. Tomorrow about the same time.
That's a very extraordinary thing, smiled Hyacinth.
Yes, but it's one of those things that you don't want to take another person's word for.
You think I ought to see it for myself? Well, perhaps I will.
Give me a whistle, if I happen to be passing, said Coronel casually. And tell me what you think. Goodbye, Hyacinth.
Goodbye, Coronel.
She nodded her head confidently at him, and then turned round and went off daintily down the hill. Coronel stared after her.
What is Udo doing? He murmured to himself. But perhaps she doesn't like animals. A whole day to wait. How endless.
If he had known that Udo, now on 2 legs again, was at that moment in Belvane's garden trying to tell her for the 5th time that week about his early life in Araby, he would have been still more surprised. We left Coronel, if you remember, in Araby. For 3 or 4 days he remained there, wondering how Udo was getting on, and feeling more and more that he ought to do something about it. On the 4th day he got onto his horse and rode off again. He simply must see what was happening. If Udo wanted to help, then he would be there to give it. If Udo was all right again, then he would go comfortably back to Araby. To tell the truth, Coronel was a little jealous of his friend. A certain Prince Perivale, who had stayed at his uncle's court, had once been a suitor for Hyacinth's hand, but losing a competition with the famous 7-headed bull of Euralia, which Merriwig had arranged for him, had made no further headway with his suit. This prince had had a portrait of Hyacinth specially done for him by his own court painter, a portrait which Coronel had seen. It was for this reason that he had at first objected to accompanying Udo to Euralia, and it was for this reason that he persuaded himself very readily that the claims of friendship called him there now. For the last week he had been waiting in the forest. Now that he was there, he was not quite sure how to carry out his mission. So far, there had been no sign of Udo, either on 4 legs or on 2. It seemed probable that unless Coronel went to the palace and asked for him, there would be no sign. And if he went to the palace and Udo was all right and the Princess Hyacinth was in love with him, then the worst would have happened. He would have to stay there and help admire Udo, an unsatisfying prospect to a man in love. For he told himself by this time that he was in love with Hyacinth, although he had never seen her. So he had waited in the forest hoping for something to turn up, and first Wiggs had come. And now at last, Hyacinth. He was very glad that he had waited. She was there on the morrow. "I knew you'd come," said Coronel. "It looks just as beautiful, doesn't it?"
"I think it's even more beautiful," said Hyacinth.
"You mean those little white clouds? That was my idea putting those in. I thought you'd like them."
"I wondered what you did all day. Does it keep you very busy?"
"Oh," said Coronel, "I have time for singing."
"Why do you sing?"
"Because I am young and the forest is beautiful."
"I have been singing this morning too."
"Why?" asked Coronel eagerly.
"Because the war with Barodia is over."
"Oh," said Coronel, rather taken aback.
"That doesn't interest you. Yet, if you were a Euralian—"
"But it interests me extremely. Let us admire the scene for a moment, while I think. Look, there is another one of my little clouds." Coronel wondered what would happen now. If the king were coming back, then Udo would be wanted no longer, save as a suitor for Hyacinth's hand. If then he returned, it would show that— But suppose he was still an animal? It was doubtful if he would go back to Araby as an animal. And then there was another possibility. Perhaps he had never come to Euralia at all. Here were a lot of questions to be answered, and here next to him was one who could answer them. But he must go carefully. 97, 98, 99, 100, he said aloud. "There, I've finished my thinking, and you've finished your looking."
"And what have you decided?" smiled Hyacinth.
"Decided?" said Coronel, rather startled. "Oh no, I wasn't deciding anything. I was just thinking. I was thinking about animals."
"So was I."
"How very curious. And also how wrong of you. You were supposed to be admiring my clouds." "What sort of animals were you thinking about?"
"Oh, all sorts."
"I was thinking about rabbits. Do you care for rabbits at all?"
"Not very much."
"Neither do I. They're so loppity." "Do you like lions?"
"I think their tails are rather silly," said Hyacinth.
"Yes, perhaps they are. Now, a woolly lamb."
"I am not very fond of woolly lambs, just now."
"No? Well, they're not very interesting. It's a funny thing," he went on casually, trying to steal a glance at her, "that we should be talking about those three animals, because I once met somebody who was a mixture of all three, together, at the same time."
"So did I,"
said Hyacinth gravely. But he saw her mouth trembling, and suddenly she turned round and caught his eye, and then they burst out laughing together. "Poor Udo," said Coronel. "And how is he looking now?"
"He is all right again now."
"All right again? Then why isn't he— But I'm very glad he isn't."
"I didn't like him,"
said Hyacinth, blushing a little. And then she went on bravely.
"But I think he found he didn't like me first."
"He wants humoring," said Coronel. "It's my business to humor him. It isn't yours." Hyacinth looked at him with a new interest.
"Now I know who you are," she said. "He talked about you once."
"What did he say?" asked Coronel, obviously dying to know.
"He said you were good at poetry."
Coronel was a little disappointed. He would have preferred Hyacinth to have been told that he was good at dragons. However, they had met now, and it did not matter. "Princess," he said suddenly, "I expect you wonder what I'm doing here. I came to see if Prince Udo was in need of help, and also to see if you were in need of help. Prince Udo was my friend, but if he has not been a friend of yours, then he is no longer a friend of mine. Tell me what has been happening here, and then tell me if in any way I can help you."
"You called me Hyacinth yesterday," she said, "and it is still my name."
"Hyacinth," said Coronel, taking her hand, "tell me if you want me at all."
"Thank you, Coronel. You see, Coronel, it's like this."
And sitting beneath Wig's Veteran of the Forest with Coronel lying at her feet, she told him everything. "It seems easy enough," he said when she had finished. "You want Udo pushed out, and the Countess put in her place. I can do the one while you do the other."
"Yes, but how do I push Prince Udo out?"
"That's what I'm going to do."
"Yes, but, Coronel, dear, if I could put the Countess in her place, shouldn't I have done it a long time ago? I don't think you quite know the sort of person she is, and I don't quite know what her place is either, which makes it rather hard to put her into it. You see, I don't think I told you that Father is rather fond of her."
"I thought you said Udo was."
"They both are."
"Then how simple. We simply kill Udo and, well, anyhow, there's one part of it done."
"Yes, but what about the other part?"
Coronel thought for a moment. "Would it be simpler if we did it the other way round?" he said. "Killed the Countess and put Udo in his place."
"Father wouldn't like that at all, and he's coming back tomorrow."
Coronel didn't quite see the difficulty. If the king was in love with the Countess, he would marry her whatever Hyacinth did, and what was the good of putting her in her place for one day if her next place was to be on the throne? Hyacinth guessed what he was thinking.
"Oh, don't you see?" she cried. "She doesn't know that the king is coming back tomorrow, and if I can only just show her, I don't mind if it's only for an hour, that I am not afraid of her, and that she has got to take her orders from me, then I shan't mind so much all that has happened these last weeks. But if she is to have disregarded me all the time, if she is to have plotted against me from the very moment my father went away, and if nothing is to come to her for it, but that she marries my father and becomes Queen of Euralia, then I can have no pride left. I will be a princess no longer."
"I must see this Belvane," said Coronel thoughtfully.
"Oh, Coronel, cried Hyacinth. "If you fall in love with her too, I think I shall die of shame."
"With her, Hyacinth?" he said, turning to her in amazement.
"Yes, you never,
Her voice trailed away. She could not meet his gaze any longer. She dropped her eyes, and the next moment his arms were round her, and she knew that she would never be alone again.